Hi, I'm Stanley Bledsoe. I'm here to do a little rundown of the space race. Now, the Soviet Union quickly launched the first ever man-made satellite into orbit. On October 4th in 1957, Sputnik was launched. First major event in the space race, Sputnik. Now, Sputnik was a breakthrough. It's made an impact on the world very clear. But for Americans, it caused massive amounts of panic because we didn't know what it was and we didn't trust the Soviet Union at all. So quickly rumors of it being a bomb, it being a tracker, literally anything. Think of anything, and that's what America probably thought it was. But for NASA, the US, just in general, this was a sign of the beginning of the space race. Now, after Sputnik 1, the Soviet Union had a plan to launch Sputnik 2, but within Sputnik 2 contained a living thing. Laika. Laika the spacewalk was a stray terrier that was used within the Soviet program to test if life would survive in space. Laika's shuttle was on the tip of the Sputnik 2 rocket, where she was cramped in a small area where she spent her last moments and died in orbit of overheating and disintegrated along with the Sputnik 2 as it re-entered Earth's atmosphere on April 14th, 1958. Soon enough, the US finally catches up with their own satellite, the Explorer 1. Now, the satellite only stopped working after a few months after launch, but it was still a massive breakthrough, as it was the sign that US was still competing and not going to deter them, that even though the Soviet Union was in the lead, that they would work to get to space, and then later, the moon. Explorer 1. The US had announced their efforts to get men into space with the Mercury missions. These missions would send one-man missions to space into the planet's orbit. Not too far after, the USSR had selected their cosmonauts to send into space. The first man ever in orbit was cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin. Yuri became an instant celebrity. He was taking tours all over the world and had humiliated the United States. Mainly, so much so, that JFK had banned him from ever coming here. That's how humiliated they were. And to make it seem like he wasn't soft on communism. That's one of the reasons too. Now, on September 12th, 1962, JFK gave his famous "We chose to go to the moon" speech.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
As America was picking up the pace, they had to send their own man into space, which that was the start of the Mercury missions, which was Alan Shepard. But, well, Alan Shepard was the second man in space, and the first American in space. He was not the first American in orbit. That was John Glenn. But the goal for Mercury was basically just get one-man missions up into space, in orbit, and hopefully eventually send crews of 2 or 3 more. Now, while the US was in the lead for a little bit, they weren't going to be for long, as the Soviet Union came back with 2 major space events. The first being the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova, and along with that, with the go-ahead of the moon programs, which that was not good for the US. And also, they did the first ever multi-person spacecraft in space. And also, the first ever spacewalk performed by cosmonaut Alexei Leonov. Now, clearly, the Soviet Union was in the lead, and we had to catch up one way or another. Now, tensions were growing to see who would make it to the moon by the end of the decade. The United States was catching up by making its own multi-person spacecraft and first spacewalk done by astronaut Ed White. But the Soviet Union, as always, did first because of the first ever lunar rover. But also, the United States, which was first for once, did the first ever docking in space, done by astronauts Commander Neil Armstrong and David Scott. Now, this almost turned very quickly into the first ever disaster in space, but thankfully they managed to abort it soon enough, as the shuttle would not stop spinning. Almost had its first disaster, but that was not the worst to come. As announced, the Apollo missions began, the first mission being Apollo 1. Now during the launch pad test for Apollo 1, tragedy had occurred, where the three-man crew of Virgil Gus Grimson, Roger Caffey, and Ed White had perished in a fire that started in the cockpit of their shuttle. This was devastating, as these were some of the first deaths relating to space. The Apollo program was delayed after the death of the crew, but as always in the space race, the Soviets were first, as cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov passed away during re-entry of his shuttle and burned in the atmosphere, being the first ever fatality in space. Now these deaths were a tragedy that should never have occurred, but as they started rushing to get to the moon by the end of the decade, they would do whatever they could to reach that goal. Now, America had made their most well-known rocket, the Saturn V. The Saturn V was the best rocket we had, starting off the Apollo program with its first flight along with the first manned flight around the moon. The Soviet Union, trying to catch up one more time, failed, as the N-1 rocket had a massive failure, and it sealed the fate of the Soviet Union, as they saw on July 20th, 1969, astronauts Neil Armstrong, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins land on the lunar surface with Apollo 11.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.